Hello there and a warm welcome to the CDP Europe Awards 2022. Now for Nature here on Euronews. Today, for the next 2 hours, we'll be checking in with global political leaders, the European Union's climate chief himself, mayors, the UN, and of course the business and financial world. We'll be asking how we supercharge our environmental efforts and get on track for a net zero, nature positive world. We'll be celebrating the companies, the cities and the investors who are walking the talk. We'll get the views from the ground. We'll speak to journalists, scientists and experts who are rethinking the system. Now we've got an amazing set of guests joining us today from the Euronews studio here in Lyon, like Maxfield Weiss, CDP Europe Executive Director. Thank you for joining us. So good to see you. First of all, what should we expect from the CDP Europe Awards 2022, Now for Nature?
Well, hello, Maeve. Today, we're going to have a serious conversation, perhaps one of the most serious conversations of our times. And that's how are we going to transform our society? How are we going to transform our economy? And really our way of thinking about how we're going to achieve net zero as well as a full recovery of nature. Now, we at CDP, we run the world's environmental disclosure system. And today, we're going to be recognizing Europe's environmental leaders. And the CDP Awards are for those companies, those cities, as well as investors who are already walking the talk, leading us towards net zero and nature positivity.
And tell us, why Now for Nature?
Well, look, when it comes to our climate crisis, we know exactly what we need to do, and that's 1.5 degrees. That's our goal, and I cannot stress this clear enough, but it's now code red for humanity. And a lot of people might not realize this, I think because it's not as evident as the impacts of the pandemic, but 1 in 8 deaths is now linked to the environmental crisis. And that's why we need to see nature and we need to see climate change as two sides of the same coin. Because we cannot solve climate change if we're not tackling biodiversity, if we're not tackling our oceans and land use and food systems, all of it head on. We need to look at it in totality. And this is because nature, it's fundamentally the source of everything that all of us survive and rely upon to survive. And in fact, half of our global GDP depends on the natural world. And if we don't do something about it now, our earth systems, they will collapse. And then our food systems, they will collapse. And our economic systems will collapse. And where we are at today, we've already passed planetary boundaries. And we're barreling towards tipping points that will create irreversible losses. And that's why it's now for nature. It's now for nature because we need a massive rethink of our economy and our society. And Maeve, we need to fundamentally embed nature into every single decision that we make from here on out. And that's precisely what our speakers, they're going to be diving into today.
Well, you're certainly not mincing your words there. Code red for humanity. And COP26 in Glasgow, of course, just took place. I'm sure you were keeping a very close eye on it. Was it a success in your mind?
Well, it's important to celebrate our successes, but I think it's also okay to be disappointed about where we're at and what we haven't achieved. And it's disastrous that we're headed still to 2.4 degrees of warming. And 1.5, it might not be dead, but we need to do so much more and so much quicker. And that's why we need all countries to really up their game when it comes to their targets this year. But I think coming out of this COP, we clearly did not see enough when it comes to finance, climate finance, specifically for developing nations related to adaptation. But coal, it's still here when it really needs to be sent to the history books. But we do need to celebrate our successes as well. And we had 140 countries from around the world who committed to end deforestation. And this is monumentous when it comes to reversing nature loss. And it's really going to be key to achieving our goal of 1.5 degrees. But we also saw from Glasgow an investor alliance called GFonds, which committed 130 trillion to net zero finance. And this is also really important because CDP's data has actually shown that just 1% of capital market funds are Paris aligned. So really, I think we saw this growing sense of scrutiny which is good, and accountability, which is also good, coming out of this COP. And I think there's this growing recognition that it's no longer enough just to have or pronounce these bold and ambitious targets. That's just step one. Where we're at now is, where is your plan to achieve it?
Absolutely. But what about nature? Where is it in all of this?
Yeah, well, nature, it had a very important seat at the table at this COP. I think there's a recognition that not only is it a major carbon sink, it's also a means for resilience. And this is good. But really, nature, it can't just be seen as this tool to cut CO2. Nature, it's the basis of human life. It's the key to ending poverty, and it's a necessity for realizing a truly just transition. And that's why, from Kunming, which is the upcoming COP for biodiversity, we need targets agreed.
Well, yeah, because that shift towards a net zero, nature positive economy, it's a huge task.
Precisely.
Can it be done, really?
You know, I'm confident. And we at CDP, we've seen the progress on the ground, specifically when everybody works together and when they have the tools. And guess what, Maeve? We in Europe, we have the tools. We have the European Green Deal, which is actually moving towards the implementation stage now. And we also have the European Climate Pact. And this is putting concrete steps into place, concrete actions to bring about a greener Europe. And of course, we have the Fit for 55 package, and this is going to hopefully help us realize our climate targets by the end of the decade. And we can't forget, last but not least, we have the new European Sustainability Reporting Standards, as well as the European Green Taxonomy. And these, CDP is going to actually align our questionnaire with, and this is going to really fuel sustainable finance. But above all, and this is something I think we all need to remember here, is that the price tag for transformation is actually quite low. And we can actually realize a net economic gain, because what we're really talking about here is a relatively small percentage of our GDP invested now, but invested in the right places. So I think really the first thing we could start with is ending the dangerous billions we're spending on fossil fuel subsidies, because we all know that there can be no new oil and gas drilling. We need to keep 60% of our reserves in the ground. And this is non-negotiable. This is science. But I'm positive that we can do it, because I've seen how we mobilize the economy during the pandemic. So the question is, will we? And if we answer yes to that question, then we need to rapidly accelerate the rate of change.
Okay, Max, you certainly set the tone for the CDP Europe Awards 2022 now for nature. And it's very time to kick off with our first debate. But first, is there anyone in particular that you're really looking forward to hearing from?
Well, today we have a many number of CEOs coming from across Europe, as well as finance chiefs. We have reporters, we have economists and scientists, we have mayors, we have civil society, and of course we have policymakers. We have everyone. But what we need is everyone to collaborate. We need everyone to collaborate to transform our system, to really exist within our planet's limits. And we at CDP, we're making that happen, because we have the data. We have the data to put at the heart of business and policy decisions, as well as investment decisions that will drive the change we need to realize a net zero economy, and one that is nature positive. But if we're really going to have a just and fair and inclusive transition, then Maeve, we need nature. Because really, when it comes down to it, the Earth's future, it's in our hands. Humanity's future is in our hands. And the time is now. It's now for nature.
Code red, as you said earlier, that's something that will definitely be sticking with me. But for now, Maxwell Weiss, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, how do we transform the way humans treat the natural world and make our economic system fit for purpose? To look at the science and economics behind our debate today, I'm delighted now to bring in Dr. Johan Rockström, Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, Sir Partha Dasgupta of the University of Cambridge, and Hans Brunich, the European Environment Agency's Executive Director. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us. My first question will be to Dr. Rockström. Now, we know that our planet is already reaching tipping point. How does this threaten the 1.5 goal? And why must climate and nature be seen as one, Dr. Rockström?
We have, just over the last 5 years, made such significant advancements in our understanding that the climate system is on Earth, to a large extent, regulated not only by our fossil fuel burning, but also by biosphere systems that help us in absorbing and dampening the disturbance caused by our fossil fuel burning. So you have the Amazon rainforest, the oceans, the ice sheets, the permafrost, the grasslands, the wetlands, absorbing and dampening and cooling. So we have more and more scientific support that the only way to hold the 1.5 degrees Celsius line, to keep global warming well below 2 and land at 1.5, requires not only to phase out fossil fuels and reach a net zero world economy by 2050 in only less than 30 years' time, but we also need to become really sustainable stewards of all the ecosystems on Earth, because they help us in holding carbon, in absorbing carbon, and cooling the planet. So it's truly a sustainability transition that we face so urgently.
A question now for Sir Dasgupta on really what is at stake now and how extreme the risks are posed by the decline in biodiversity.
As Dr. Rockström has just pointed out, the demand we are making on the biosphere's goods and services vastly exceeds the biosphere's capacity to supply them on a sustainable basis, okay? Some crude calculations suggest that the ratio is about 1.6, which we get the metaphor that we need 1.6 Earths to satisfy our needs. Now, that's not going to happen. There aren't 1.6 Earths. So we have to either decrease demand or help to rejuvenate the biosphere by allowing it to supply more, because we have trashed the biosphere enormously, all the ecosystems that Dr. Rockström has just pointed out to, okay? And most important, before I conclude, one shouldn't think that the tipping points are just lying in the future, which is very often the criticism that we environmental scientists face from those who think we are overreaching our worries. Local communities have faced exhaustion of their local resources. Otherwise, you can't explain these distress migration that takes place from one region to another, and where they're not welcome because the people who are trying to be hosts are also very poor. So this has happened.
Okay, well, let's get the view from Brussels and bring in Mr. Hans Brunich and ask you, what actions when it comes to nature do Europeans need to prioritise?
Well, I think in the last 2 years, Europe has put forward a really important package of priorities in addressing these issues. The European Green Deal brings together a lot of the elements that were referred to by the colleagues Rockström and Dasgupta in the European Green Deal, where indeed one makes the connection between biodiversity, between climate change and resource use, and also looks, I would say, at the fundamental underpinnings of going to a sustainable system, and that is addressing the key economic drivers of unsustainability: the energy system, the food system, the mobility system, the built environment. So by addressing the fundamental unsustainability of these systems, I think we are at least carving out the pathways, the trajectories that are needed. So the priorities are out there. I think the difficulty is now translating this in what I would call bending the trend dynamics, because the trends over the last 40, 50 years in all of these issues have been negative, and it's not enough to slow them down. We now really need to bend the trends, and that will require deep transitions in the core systems of the European and the global economy.
Okay, and Dr. Rockström, what would a nature-positive economic model look like for people? How would it differ from today's?
Well, I think Partha Dasgupta's report recently on the economics of biodiversity has to a large extent the answers to that question. I mean, putting value on natural asset, having strong sustainability, which means that the economy must now develop within scientifically defined planetary boundaries or guardrails, whatever you want to call them. There is a fence beyond which we take risks of irreversible changes, but within which we can have equity and prosperity. And I think this is a shift in the economic system. So it doesn't, in my mind at least, necessarily mean that we throw the economic system overboard, but we have to domesticate it, so to say. We have to keep it within finite bounds and put the right value on nature so that we become more efficient and as Partha points out, release the demand of unsustainable overuse of natural resources and the functioning of ecosystems.
Okay, but the value on nature. And Sir Dasgupta, pricing the living world is suggested by mainstream economics to correct externalities. But do you think that's enough for nature to fully recover by 2050?
No, because there's the other side of it also, which is that the nature requires a lot of investment. And bear in mind that investing in nature does not mean lots of machinery. It means leaving parts of nature alone, let her recover. We really need to reorganize our notion of what constitutes economic success. It should not be seen as GDP because it's highly misleading. We really ought to be doing an inventory of assets, which includes Mother Nature. So in my review, I suggest, and not suggest, we show that the right index is something like the inclusive wealth of nations. So each year, a nation ought to estimate the wealth it has access to, not just produced capital, not just human capital, but natural capital as well.
But Hans, I guess my question for you, if you could be brief, please. What hope do we have of agreeing ways to factor in externalities when global policymakers can't even tax carbon?
Well, I think that's where the fundamental rethinking needs to take place. And right now we are still thinking mostly in terms of GDP is the sort of ultimate tape measure. The economy can draw on the resources of society and creates a lot of inequality on top of that. And it can then almost for free use natural capital. So this fundamental rethinking and embedding that in governance practices, in economic pricing mechanisms, in tax approaches, in ownership approaches, in producer responsibility, all of those elements you can bring together. There is a ton of research and a ton of knowledge on that, but it all starts with the fundamental reconfiguration of the starting point, and that has to be that natural capital is the foundational and ultimately the enabling capital for a vibrant society on a planetary scale.
Do you think people will have to just get used to a more limited way of life for the sake of a healthier planet?
What Hans describes here requires definitely a kind of a shift towards not only inclusive wealth for policy, but also a recognition what is value of life for all citizens on Earth. At the same time, I think Partha has a key point here, that if you start charging and putting value on natural assets, you can have social dividends to give some kind of soft buffer and kind of soft landing for those communities in the world that will be having the toughest transition from our current unsustainable world towards the sustainable landing. So I think you have to be recognizing also that we're in a very turbulent phase of transition.
Okay, Mr. Brunich, you wanted to make a point? Come in.
Yes, I think it's really important as well to focus on inequality. I cannot be convinced that the current inequality on this planet between countries, within countries, can be a fertile ground for fundamental sustainability. So addressing the social dimension, the distributional aspects, I think will be an absolutely fundamental precondition to put us on that trajectory.
The point about inequality is extremely deep poverty is connected with environmental degradation because it's not a coincidence that the world's poorest countries are in the tropics. And also the richest biodiversity is also in the tropics. The two coincide. If we pay for it, they will enjoy the benefits, the poor, the real poor.
I want to ask you about the payments that you promoted to nations for protecting ecosystems. Can the approach, for example, in Gabon, charging rents for their natural assets, be scaled globally, do you think?
Well, this is becoming, it's like paying for what you're consuming. We've been free riding, all right? Pretty much all rich societies have been doing that. So yes, pricing is extremely important. And the institutional changes that are required in order to be able to establish these prices, and now payment for ecosystem services is just one. And it's happening internally within countries, of course. It's happening in Costa Rica, the UK, China, and elsewhere. But we do need to have payments for ecosystem services at the international level, like the global commons. And payment for countries which house the global commons, the global public goods like the tropical rainforest, because they house those few countries house these enormous capital assets, but the benefits of which we're all enjoying.
And Dr. Rockstrom, with COVID, for example, with the pandemic, we've seen that politics can react boldly to crises when they want. So thinking outside the box, what policies would bring us in line with our planet's boundaries?
It's so good that you connect this dialogue to the COVID crisis, because we are in the midst of a climate crisis, we're in the midst of an ecological crisis, and we're putting the livability on Earth for all future generations at risk. I would like us to look at the COVID crisis and act, at least, but preferably a factor 10 more actively to solve the climate crisis.
And a final question for the three of you. 2030 is around the corner and we can't change our system of resource extractive capitalism in just 8 years. But are you optimistic that companies and markets can find the answers? We'll start with Sir Dasgupta.
This is a hard one to predict. I don't know enough about this business sector, but I've had about 100 or so events since my review was launched with the private sector. And albeit it was a self-selected group, there's self-selection at work, but there's no question. They're extremely well informed. They're extremely concerned about their bottom line, by the way.
And Dr. Rockstrom, same question to you about companies and markets.
Let me start with the negative side, which is that I'm deeply concerned because we're running out of time. We're running out of time because we're bumping towards the edge of the resilient capacity of both the climate system and the biosphere. So in that sense, it's really worrying whether we'll be able to kind of have a safe landing in time. On the other side, something very special has happened over just the last 5 years. We've turned a corner where the whole sustainability agenda is moving rapidly from climate to all the planetary boundaries, and also becoming much more central to the boardrooms and the CEO level of companies. It's no longer just a corporate social responsibility agenda. It's rather a strategy to be competitive, to be successful, to be able to move and develop into the future of the next phase of modern development in the world.
Just briefly then, Hans Brunich, your final thoughts there?
I would say, yes, of course, the private sector will have to play a critical role, but it will have to be credible, transparent, and accountable. And I think that's where, for example, the Sustainable Finance Initiative in Europe can play a role, but also where the CDP can play a role in driving business towards that change, but in a credible, transparent, and accountable manner.
One final point, which is conversations on these problems very often revert to climate change. And it can mislead us because there is a sense in which there's a technological fix that's possible, namely move to clean energy. Clean energy being non-fossil fuels, okay? The trouble is that this is not going to work for biodiversity loss. We really need institutional changes which price the objects so that we have to pay for it. In other words, to cushion the demand we make. So that's one. And the final point related to this is this, that we also tend to think that it's the government's problem, that they ought to be doing it. Of course, they must be involved. Go without saying, that's transparent. But we citizens need to act in concert because it's a global problem we all face, all right? And with the prices rising for these goods, if we can make them, we can charge for them, then the direction of technological change, which will be undertaken not by governments, but the private sector, will change. It will be nature-saving technological device, not labor-saving technological device. And that should usher in a new era. And it's entirely possible that our great-grandchildren will have a better life than we do, by the way. This is not a story of only pessimism here.
That brings us to an end. Thank you so much, Hans Brunich, Sir Partha Dasgupta, and Dr. Johan Rockstrom. Thank you so much for your time and very insightful contributions. Thank you so much. Well, we've heard from the scientists, so it's time now to bring in the cities and meet two of Europe's most ambitious mayors. Now, despite the powers that they may have, most cities can only improve by teaming up with business, with investors, and of course, other parts of government. To learn what this looks like in practice, we can bring in now Dario Nardella, the Mayor of Florence, and Raymond Johansson, Governing Mayor of Oslo. Welcome to you both to the CDP Europe Awards 2022.
Hello, good morning.
Thank you.
So I'd like to ask you both, have you considered how much your city relies on nature and biodiversity, and if this has driven action or not? Florence first, Mr. Nadella?
Yes, so Florence has decided long ago to be a zero-volume city, improving the quality of our estate and spaces without losing additional natural space. And we put great attention to water management and the water environment along our River Arno, and green areas are one of our most important topics in the new policies. My city, Florence, has a long history in the design of gardens, now thanks also to the partnership with the private sector and crowdfunding. And we are planting a lot of trees in the urban area and creating urban gardens with green trees and fresh fruit for the benefits of our citizens, because we have to protect our environment. That's because we have a big project for next 10 years. We want to plant 1 million trees in the whole metropolitan area.
1 million trees. Wow. Okay, and same question to you, Mr. Johansson in Oslo.
First of all, I think it's important that the pandemic really showed us and highlighted how important the nature is for the well-being of the inhabitants of Oslo. And we are extremely lucky from the nature side to be surrounded by nature of all sides. And in fact, despite being the capital of Norway and a quite big city, Oslo is actually the county in Norway with the highest number of registered species. And having such a high biodiversity also means that we have a lot to protect. The rivers, the streams connect the large forest from the north and east, and it gives us the green corridors that we are working to maintain, restore and improve. And it's important for us to protect that. So biodiversity is very important for us.
Okay, and of course for your citizens who flock, I'm sure, to those green spaces in Oslo. And I'm curious, how are you currently collaborating with local private businesses in order to cut emissions? And what specific impact has this had so far? Mr. Nadella?
Private sectors has always been involved, because we can't reach our vision targets on our own. And we have different forms of collaboration, from data sharing to specific regeneration projects, tests of innovative technologies, or cooperation on upcoming issues like cybersecurity. And we want to strengthen this cooperation, heading to common and more ambitious targets.
And what about you, Mr. Johansson? I mean, you did mention earlier how you were beefing up electric cars, but what other example have you got with collaboration with the private sector?
The city of Oslo use procurement to push business community to deliver green solutions, and that's important for us. For example, we say that by 2025, only bids that can deliver zero-emission constructions machinery in tenders for municipal buildings will be eligible. And this gives us also the private sector predictability and time to change the machinery. So I think we are totally dependent on the private businesses, but they need also a predictability that we as a municipality have to contribute to them. So they are very, very close partners.
And just briefly, Mr. Nadella, do you hope or expect that EU recovery funds will help fund Florence with their climate ambitions?
Oh yes, the recovery funds are fundamental for our cities. The local recovery plan has been designed in line with the city's vision to improve sustainability and social aspects like social inclusion and energy poverty. It could boost our results and speed up the achievement of net zero targets. Some projects have been already approved under the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, as a tramway system, and other as urban forestry, energy efficiency, or the new football stadium refurbishment. That's only some examples that we are working on.
Cities can, of course, drive change in food systems. You have the power and see the co-benefits on people's wealth and, of course, equity and social inclusion. So I want to know, what is Oslo doing exactly to improve food and the wider global impact your city is having?
We got quite a lot of press coverage recently because we have decided to make vegetarian meals the standard for food served by the municipality. And this does not mean that only vegetarian meals will be served, but that you have to ask for the meat options. And but setting up a sustainable food system, it's much more than just vegetarian menu. The city buys food for some 16 million euros a year, and in our procurement we look at buying more plant-based food, asking about animal welfare, whether it's produced locally, if it's in organic and seasonal meats. We also have the aim to reduce the city's food waste by 50% by 2030. So this has led to a big debate here in Norway as well. So it's difficult, but we have put that forward.
And Mr. Johansen, has your city been assessing the so-called co-benefits of climate action, like the positive impacts on health, the cost of living and well-being? Is that something that you and your team there are working on?
Yeah, it's a very important issue. The green shift needs to be fair. And the whole climate discussion can not just be a middle-class project. We need to take into account that all the people needs to see that it's beneficiary for them to be a part of the green shift. This is very important. And we can see that the support for our green policy, it's often stronger in the city center than in the outskirts of Oslo. And that's a challenge, but we will not win if we're not able to get all people on board. Then we will not be able to win elections on a green ticket if there's so polarized the whole discussion. So I think that's a challenge throughout Europe to get people on board and to get it less polarized and to see that there's something in it for all the people.
You cannot get there alone. You have to have your citizens on board. So how are your cities getting meaningful participation from people on this journey towards becoming nature positive and net zero?
So the collaboration and engagement with citizens, is a crucial point for my city, and I think for all cities in the world, in Europe especially. And we have started long ago with the participatory processes in the design of our main plans. For example, for strategical plan and a sustainable energy plan and a smart city plan and sustainable mobility plan. And we have exploited many different engagement channels and the techniques to be as much as possible in touch with our citizens and involving them since the beginning. That's the point, not at the end of the process. And we have also contributed to a specific guide in a framework of European Horizon project about this topic, and in the Smart Cities guidance package to share our experience and find innovative tools.
Okay.
So at the end of history, nothing is possible without our citizens.
Well, best of luck with that ongoing challenge, and thank you so much to you both for joining us here at the CDP Europe 2022 Awards. Raymond Johansen, the governing mayor of Oslo, thank you so much for your time. And Dario Nardella, the mayor of Florence, thank you so much. And I hope you can catch a glass of water there. Well, it's time now for our first awards and to meet A-list cities for 2021. Connecting from Brussels is CDP's Miriam Wolfram, Director, Policy Engagement. Miriam, what gets a city on this A-list? And tell us, who made it this year?
Well, this year we're recognizing 26 European cities, including Florence and Oslo, who we just heard from. And cities on the A list are effectively working to cut emissions and to build healthy, resilient cities. And for an A, cities have to have an emission reduction target. They have to have their fair share to contribute to 1.5. They have to measure their risks and publish climate action and adaptation plans. And also, cities must be making progress.
It should be obvious, but remind us, why is nature so important for cities and, of course, for people?
Well, nature and climate are actually two sides of the same coin. Mayors have to tackle mitigation and adaptation in tandem, and nature really helps on both sides of this coin. They help on decarbonization and on resilience. For example, look at the extreme heat that we get across Europe in summer increasingly. Nature helps to reduce urban heat and to cut energy needs from, for example, air conditioning.
Now, I understand that CDP will be changing things for cities reporting next year, right? What are the main changes?
The main change is that we will make it easier for cities across Europe to participate in CDP's disclosure by offering a simpler questionnaire. We will align it with key themes such as energy and resilience, and CDP will track progress on key actions such as science-based targets and investment. And also it will be TCFD aligned, and this means that we make cities speak the language of their public and private investors who get more and more interested in cities data, especially on cities' financing needs and opportunities.
And finally, Miriam, what are the most important things for cities to be doing right now?
Disclose to CDP, build climate and nature into your city master planning, measure risks and create a plan to adapt, set science-based targets in line with 1.5 and focus on major emissions hotspots such as your energy, your transport and your buildings. Increase nature-based solutions and collaborate with your companies and investors. And learn from others. What works well in one city might be a successful model in your city as well. And finally, talk to CDP so we can support you on your journey to a net zero, nature-positive city.
Okay. A long to-do list there for cities. Thank you so much, Miriam Wolfram, Director, Policy Engagement from CDP. And now, let's get to know some of those A-list cities.
More people than ever before are being careful about how much they consume, how much waste they produce, and are starting to think seriously about their carbon footprint, and Florence wants to do its part to save the planet.
Now for Nature means being part of a large family of climate-committed cities, having common challenges and searching for common solutions.
We will not only maintain, but will increase biodiversity. Everyone in Turku shall have the chance to enjoy rich nature.
For Porto, Now for Nature means transition to a carbon-neutral, resilient, circular and thriving city.
Means finding policies that combine climate action with nature preservation. We need to team up with nature to succeed in creating livable, resilient and zero emissions cities.
We understand the importance of combining adaptation with resilience and mitigation. Our actions mitigate emissions at the same time as we protect the most vulnerable, enhance urban nature and upgrade the quality of life in Athens overall.
We've reached a 22% reduction of carbon dioxide emissions in just 10 years.
We will be climate neutral in 2030, which we have also stated in a climate city contract, signed by us and several national authorities.
European climate pledges today are carbon neutral city by 2029, strong development of circular economy with citizens and companies, promotion of biodiversity and partnerships for nature.
The most important climate measure is electrification of vehicles.
Because we have a bold vision for a carbon neutral and resilient city.
Our CDP Cities A list is the result of a long-term strategy for a greener and more inclusive city based on co-productive decision-making and integrated planning, and the enabler of a reactive and resilient city.
It's the result of political environmental commitment during 50 years. resulting in good cooperation with stakeholders and massive reduction of greenhouse gases.
Is a result of very long-term and ambitious work. It's also enabler of making our city carbon neutral already by 2025.
Is cooperation, because the only way to reach our goals is to engage, collaborate, and stimulate private actors and local stakeholders.
Is collaboration. Together with our most ambitious companies, organizations, our university, and of course, our inhabitants, we are ready to reach further.
We are happy that City of Espoo has maintained its place on the A list. It is the result of cooperation with the whole community, citizens, companies, universities, and the city organization. When we do things together, we succeed.
Now from the City Hall to the boardroom, where European companies are rapidly setting ambitious targets. But what about delivery? What can we expect in the next few years? And how can corporates stay focused as they look at their impacts on emissions and nature? Joining me to debate turning targets to transformation are Francesco Sarazzi, CEO of the Italian green supermajor Enel, Gilbert Gustein, the CEO of the Swiss fragrance and flavour company Firmenich, and Jürgen Esser, Chief Financial Officer at Danone. Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. Now let's start with a question at the heart of today's event, and that is, of course, nature. What are your specific nature-based goals and how are you measuring them? Let's kick off first with Francesco.
First of all, let's say that we are part of this big alliance, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is something that has, let's say, it's the sister of the IPCC when you talk about climate. It's a convention in which we set together with many other entities and companies targets that deal with biodiversity and nature preservation under a certain, say, hierarchy, which is basically avoid, minimize, restore, and offset. These goals are those that guide us developing our work. And actually, we have today more than 180 projects in all the world that have to do with mitigating and restoring biodiversity in certain parts of the world.
And Jürgen, you, of course, are also working with science-based targets as well. But what about science-based targets for nature specifically? What are you looking to target, Jürgen?
Yeah, look, as a food company, healthy food needs healthy nature. And therefore, what we are doing is we are really trying to integrate our nature targets into our targets for climate. This is very complex and very multidimensional because nature is complex. But we have been piloting, for example, with our Alpro brand since year 2018, how to define nature targets and how to integrate them into our climate targets. And this has been a very successful pilot for us. And this is now what we are working on with the initiative for science-based targets for nature in order to articulate that journey.
And what about you? Same question to you, Gilbert. What is Firmenich up to?
Nature is the base, and we have set ourselves science-based targets to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees in line with the Paris Agreement. And since then, we have been acting on these measures every single day. And also on top of this, on top of the actions that we are taking every day with the way we engage with farmers across the world, from Madagascar and vanilla, to vetiver in Haiti, because at the end of the day, we source 450 botanicals from all over the world. And why is nature critical? Just to give you an example, you need 3.5 tons of petal roses to produce 1 kilo of essential oil that we use in your perfumes and in your shampoos. So that's why nature is the base. And we needed to harvest it in a very responsible way. And this is why regenerative agriculture is key.
And Jürgen, why do you think is a nature positive approach important from the Chief Financial Officer's perspective, where you're sitting?
Look, you can look at that discussion from very different angles. But in the end, the conclusion is always the same. Our shareholders are urging us to transform to the most sustainable business model. Our clients, our retailers want us to have the most sustainable product portfolio. Our employees, they want to work for a company which is showing the path, who is a pioneer in sustainability. But the most important, I believe, is the consumer. Because the consumer is more and more aware of climate change, of the need to protect nature. And the consumer is making his choice, buying products and buying brands who have a positive contribution. And so this is what everything is circling about. And this is also why me as a CFO, we need to make sure that we have a holistic approach as a company.
With the consumer, of course, at the heart of it all. Very interesting. And Francesco, tell me, how is INA's impact on water security interlinked with its climate efforts? Does your work on one help with the other, do you think?
Definitely. I think it is something that Jürgen said very well. Nature is a very complex system, and one part of nature affects all the others. So clearly, we deal with electricity, but water is very often instrumental to either generate or help generating electricity in many ways. And there are a lot of ways in which we can mitigate the use of water, recycle water, and reduce the use of water for our production. In fact, we have one of our tasks has to do with the fact that we will use less and less water going forward. And that water we will use, we will recycle in order to not have an impact on the water balance of the areas of the world where we operate. Why that is important is because clearly, if you want to reduce the risk going forward of your operations being sustainable, you need to reduce the footprint not only of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, but also of land use, water use, and in general, natural resource around the world.
Okay, and I'd like to ask you all regarding climate and nature and its impact through the value chain with suppliers and customers. Are you asking specifically for SBTs there, for science-based targets?
We do. This is what we are driving across the chain with our suppliers. We feel very proud as a company that we are running at 100% renewable electricity globally since early 2020, and we have also two of our manufacturing facilities in the world, one in Singapore and one in South Africa, that is running on carbon neutral. And as a company, we've set ourselves a very clear goal, to be carbon neutral by 2025, and we are committed to deliver against this goal.
And now I'll go back to Jürgen, because Danone has a carbon-adjusted recurring earnings per share metric. Do you think that other companies should too? And are you factoring in other impacts on nature?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because it's all about transparency in the moment. And what we thought with this EPS adjusted by the theoretical cost of our carbon emission is to start to have a dialogue with our shareholders and our stakeholders, which is not a dialogue which is only about financials or a dialogue which is only about non-financial impact. It's to have a dialogue which is totally integrated. And having this dialogue about a P&L, the earnings you are having by share, and adding to it the today theoretical cost of our carbon emission has been proving to be extremely powerful. Is that the best KPI moving forward? I don't know. But what I can tell you is that the engagement we have received from our stakeholders, the engagement for discussion received by our shareholders, to have finally one KPI which is embracing holistically the impact we are having, I think that has been a big success.
And Francesco, I'd like to ask you, because energy investment is, of course, 50% of what's needed for net zero. Now, Enel is investing 160 billion. But my question is that enough to get renewable capacity to the level industry really needs?
Of course, alone Enel cannot change the world, but it is for us a big jump. With this decade, which we already, by the way, in 22, so it's already started, we will treble the capacity of renewables that we have Mind you, we are already the fastest growing company in that space since now 4 years. So this is the 5th year in which we beat the world record of capacity installation, which is needed in order to meet the requirements of our strategy going forward. We have 54,000 megawatts of installed capacity. We'll go up to 145,000 by end of the decade, which means we will remain basically at 3%, that's the number, of the world total renewable energy space at that time, being at 3% now. So that tells you that even trebling our capacity just keeps us in the space. That gives you an idea of how fast this world is expanding in the renewable energy space and how much money is thrown at it.
And what we've been hearing, of course, at the CDP Europe Awards 2022, the message always being brought home is that it has to be together, that no one can do this alone. So just on that point of collaborations, are you involved in collaborations that bring about economic, environmental and social outcomes in local areas?
The key word, you're right. The key word is collaboration, because we realized we are all interdependent. This decade, has been, the past decade, has been the warmest on record, and we have to work together in order to make a difference. Internally, as a company, we have decoupled our growth output from our emissions, and we are working with our suppliers, to bring down their emissions. And just to highlight how the system works, we are the scope 3 emissions of the L'Oreal, Unilever, and Nestle of this world. Our suppliers, will be our scope 3 emissions. So we have to work hands in hand, across the chain to make sure that, we bring the global emissions down. And this is where, we are all supporting each other on this one.
And Jürgen, same question to you briefly.
Stepping back a little bit, in Danone, when we talk about climate or we talk about nature, we need to talk about agriculture. In Danone, 2/3 of our CO2 emission has a link to agriculture, 90% of our water footprint. And so, yes, there are things we can do alone. And we have very ambitious projects like moving to 100% regenerative agriculture in France for everything what we are sourcing locally in France by 2025. But we need to recognize that we are present in more than 100 countries. And so in order to have an impact, rather faster than later, we need to use the power of the collective. And so in that sense, already in 2019, we spearheaded the coalition, a coalition which is called One Planet Business for Biodiversity, in order to group together companies who have the same vision, who have the same ambition to strengthen biodiversity. Companies who had, until that moment, also tried, like us, to work with their own approaches, to work with their own definitions, and where we have now, I think, a powerful set of company and stakeholders together who are harmonizing their approach, which is the only way to create scale, to multiply impact. And today we have a number of great examples on the ground where we can have impact on local communities.
On the issue of biodiversity, which, by the way, is extremely fragmented and very difficult to manage because it varies a lot, thank God, this is incredibly complicated but a fascinating experience. You can even improve the biodiversity of the areas you work in, provided you put some attention and some work on that. We have incredible experiences in Latin America for areas where we started working, and after several years of our presence there, the biodiversity has improved when compared to the situation we presented at the beginning. The secret here is to kind of work with the people at the location and not just with government entities somewhere from far away. And having the communities together is fundamental for the success of these endeavors.
Are you optimistic that we will achieve a net zero nature positive global economy by 2050? Francesco?
Yes, I think we will reach a net zero. The only question is how big this net word is vis-a-vis the zero word. And I think the lowest net is the best solution. So fight for zero and then put the net at the end.
I'm 100% convinced that we are on the right way. I mean, today, 90% of the global economy have committed to net zero. That's great. Now we need to go from commitment to action, which means setting targets, measure achievement, and raising the bar. When you see what we have done in Danone, I mean, already in 2015 we have committed to net zero. In 2019 we have peaked the absolute emission of CO2, and since then we are decreasing year on year. And 2021, and we have just published our results, we have been decreasing by almost 4% our CO2 emission, and guess what? A lot of it contributed to regenerative agriculture. So I think we can do it. We cannot do it alone. We can do it together, and I think we are on the right pathway.
And the same question to Gilbert.
I am an eternal optimist, and I am definitely optimistic that we will hit these targets. Awareness is there. Everyone is raising up to the challenge. There are technologies that are available today that are helping us, accelerate this process. And I know, based on the information I have and the engagement that we have with suppliers, that are many technologies that are in the making that can help us also turbocharge against this target. So this target is on site. We are committed, and we are delivering. We will be delivering against our goals.
So quite an optimistic conclusion there. Thank you so much to you all. Thank you to Francesco Saraccia, CEO of the Italian green supermajor Enel, Gilbert Gostein, CEO of Swiss fragrance and flavour company Firmenich, and Jürgen Esser, the Chief Financial Officer at Danone. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, for our first corporate awards, I'm joined again by Max Field-Weiss, of course, the Executive Director of CDP Europe. Max, we're celebrating here the CDP A-list. What does that mean?
Well, CDP, we scored a record 12,000 companies who disclosed on their environmental impacts this past year. And just 2% of those companies made it onto our prestigious A-list. And 89 of those companies are located here in Europe. So the CDP A-list, it represents those companies who are driving us to a truly sustainable economy that works for people as well as for planet.
So are we seeing progress, do you believe?
Well, here at CDP, we raised the bar this year on the climate change questionnaire. So we actually have fewer leaders. And we did so because the climate crisis, it demands it, and the science, it's evolving. So what it means to be a leader is actually evolving. But we did have an uplift in terms of the number of companies on both the water and forest questionnaire. And I'm proud that 40% of all A-listers for forests are located here in Europe. And that's because we're recognizing now that companies are waking up to the evolving nature of the climate crisis, and they're taking real action.
And the big question, of course, what must a company do to get an A?
Well, A-listers disclose their impacts fully, and they have ambitious science-based targets. They're also taking meaningful action to deliver real change in their value chains. And we know that A-listers are successful because they've actually outperformed the stock market by nearly 6% over the past decade.
And Max, what are you doing to ensure companies are not greenwashing?
Well, to drive about a 1.5 degree world that's net zero, and to live in harmony with nature, we need all companies setting ambitious science-based targets. And they need to be accountable to their progress. And we, of course, need to make sure that they're existing within the planet's limits. So we made it so much more difficult to be on the A-list this year. And in the future, we're going to align our scoring to transition scoring. So this means that we'll be assessing companies for their past and future environmental impacts. We'll be measuring progress against ambition, and we'll be checking companies' targets to make sure that they're in line with 1.5 degrees and a full recovery of nature. And of course, we'll be tracking progress.
Tracking progress, so crucial, of course. Well, now, let's meet some of those companies.
We are really happy that this year's theme is Now for Nature, because decarbonizing the world's energy systems through green energy acceleration must go hand in hand with protecting biodiversity.
Now for Nature means becoming climate neutral by 2040 and save our planet for coming generations.
Now for Nature means supporting water security and working towards healthy watersheds.
In February this year, we brought forward our previous commitment by 10 years.
Now for Nature means working now to ensure the sustainability along the entire life cycle of our product.
It means that climate and biodiversity hold the same level of urgency.
Now for Nature means to work every day to design a better planet, enabling a decarbonized world.
acceleration of our CSR strategy with concrete actions and even more ambitious commitments for the years to come.
Accelerating the leadership in climate management will provide a competitive advantage to the group with solid benefits for all shareholders and stakeholders.
We act now. We act to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050 and to prevent further biodiversity losses.
En Telefónica tenemos objetivos muy ambiciosos para 2025 ser cero neto en nuestros principales mercados y 2040 en toda nuestra huella y nuestra cadena de valor.
We have robust programs in place to ensure that by 2025, 100% of our key renewable raw and packaging materials are sourced responsibly and deforestation-free.
During 2021, we were the first energy company in the world to have our net zero plan approved by Science Based Targets initiative.
The final aim is to achieve net zero emissions in 2050.
Together with our customers and partners, we are saving 99 million tons of CO2 annually.
To launch the first FSC certified tire in the world, thus protecting forest and biodiversity.
We firmly believe that collective action is crucial and more powerful than the action of single players.
It's not just the work of one corporation. We need a partnership between public bodies, private enterprise and civic society.
We need investors and capital markets to make sure that financing goes to sustainable companies.
To achieve our environmental ambitions and ensure a fair energy transition, we need investor and capital markets to demonstrate their support more strongly for those companies showing real environmental commitments.
We need clear and consistent directions for business, from policymakers or regulators, to achieve our environmental targets faster.
We're willing to contribute our share, but policymakers have to support the transition.
We at Barry Callebaut welcome frameworks currently being designed to eradicate deforestation in our industry.
We call on policymakers to accelerate climate action, to achieve our environmental targets faster, and to make sustainable business the norm.
The one word that describes our A-list achievement this year is teamwork.
It's a great acknowledgement for us in Rema, and we're very, very proud and hope to be even more a part of the solution in the future.
These CDP ratings highlight Holcim's transparency and actions to mitigate climate change and to ensure water security.
This is the third year in a row we have been recognized by CDP for our commitment in terms of sustainability and climate change.
It proves we are a front-runner in the postal and e-commerce sector.
Scale, because without scalability, reaching our target of becoming carbon and forest positive is just not possible.
Determination. Holistic water management takes years of commitment, focus, and steady collective progress.
We have to ensure that our net zero pathway is for and with the people, and therefore the transition will remain inclusive.
First, we are transforming our product portfolio and further develop our more sustainable product range, Ecolutions. And second, we are also transforming our electricity supply towards renewables.
The biggest challenge in this work lies within the supply chain.
Is to truly have an impact on the emission generated by production and raw materials.
To accelerate emission reductions throughout the value chain in line with the required 1.5 degree emission reduction scenario.
It's not only a privilege and an honor, but also a confirmation that we are working in the right direction in the fight against climate change and deforestation.
That the global food system in its current form causes large impact on the planet and contribute to global warming. CDP is helping us to focus our work on reducing carbon emission in line with the Paris Agreement.
Our efforts of today are our answers to the environmental challenges of tomorrow.
Commitment to targets and commitment to action to grow while impacting positively the planet.
The time for action is now.
We need the world to run with us.
Now, for more on this, who better to speak to than the EU's climate chief himself, Frans Timmermans, the European Commission's Executive Vice President. I caught up with him to ask him about the progress of the European Green Deal and get his vision for the future of Europe. Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, we all know you at this stage. You're, of course, the face of the European Green Deal. How confident are you that the European Green Deal will deliver an economically competitive and just transformation in the way we live, produce and consume here in Europe?
Pretty confident. There's a lot of leadership, not just in politics, but also in the private sector and among citizens. This is one of the main concerns our citizens have, even in the middle of this pandemic. The climate crisis keeps them busy and they're worried about it. So we have a mandate to act. And there's a lot of willingness to act at the individual level, at the level of society. So I'm pretty confident we can actually accomplish what we set out to do.
Well, as you always say, you cannot do it alone. So what kind of precise collaboration would you like to see from cities, from companies, big and small, from regions, from investors, and of course from citizens?
Well, show what you're doing, because so many people are doing so many things. I'm so inspired by what many cities are doing, greening the city, electrifying public transport, creating circular economy. I'm so inspired by what many private companies are doing. Industry is really changing. You have some real leaders here, but they should be vocal about what they're doing. They should show what they're doing, because that inspires others to follow suit.
And is Europe ready to weather this climate crisis?
Well, I think, I think we're not ready to just let it go, because if we let it go, the price we will have to pay in terms of human suffering, but also in financial terms, in terms of economic loss, will be huge. As soon as we are aware that the price of non-action is much, much higher than the price of action, we will get the whole of society to move into the right direction. We're not there yet. There's still too many people who think that just staying put is the best option because they think that doesn't cost anything. But we need to be very much aware of the fact that not acting is going to cause much, much higher cost in all sorts of terms rather than acting.
And let's talk more about biodiversity, and all eyes, of course, on the COP15 taking place and coming, if it takes place. The biggest biodiversity conference in a decade. What should the outcome be?
Well, I think we need to have very, very clear conclusions on how we protect our nature, how we create areas where we let nature recover. To give you one example, if you let parts of our oceans recover, it recovers so fast. Fish stocks come back, natural resources are restored. Just leaving it alone, you don't need to do anything else. And so setting parts of our natural environment aside from human activity or from economic activity that exploits the natural environment is going to help nature restore. And this is, I think, something we need to conclude in Kunming.
And do you get the feeling that reversing nature loss is a priority?
I think it is becoming more and more a priority because I think people are aware and being made aware through the pandemic that if we neglect our natural environment, it's a direct threat to our health and to our survival. So I think it lags a bit behind the urgency of the climate crisis, but it's going to get there as well.
And CDP data has shown that 1% of global fund assets are 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned. So I want to ask you, when will we see the impact of EU efforts to build a credible anti-greenwashing financial framework?
That's a very good question. That's one of the complicated tasks we are placed in front of. Taxonomy helps, but also financial regulation helps. Standards in terms of good business practices help. But more than anything else, the investment they want, the investment community wants the investment to be green. So we need to put them in a position that we can assure them that what they're investing in is green, and that's through regulation as well.
And I just wanted to ask you about the state of pan-European energy politics. I mean, in the context now, if you look around the last couple of months, net zero doesn't look too likely.
Well, the thing is we're challenged in the short term because of the high energy prices. Now, the absolute wrong conclusion would be to slow down our transition to renewable energy, because renewable energy is cheap and we need to speed up our transition to renewable energy. That will bring prices down. Now, any fundamental transition in your energy system is complicated. We've been based on carbon for the last 200 years, and we need to base ourselves on non-carbon now. That is a fundamental transition that's going to be very complicated. But I do maintain the faster we do this, the sooner we can offer affordable energy prices to our citizens. The sooner we wean ourselves of the dependency of fossil fuel, the better it is for our citizens.
Okay, Frans Timmermans, Executive Vice President, thank you so much for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
Europe is an example. That's according to the EU's Green Deal chief, Frans Timmermans. But Europe cannot do it alone. On that note, let's check in now with the two women leading international efforts on climate and nature. Patricia Espinosa, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Elizabeth Mrema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, also known as the CBD. Thank you both for joining us. First question to Executive Secretary Mrema. Why is 2030 such a crucial date for reaching net nature positivity?
What is at stake is the loss of biodiversity reaching unprecedented rates in the history of humankind. Climate change and biodiversity are two global, inseparable environmental crises or challenges which we are all facing. We cannot deal with climate change without biodiversity loss, neither we cannot deal with biodiversity loss without climate change.
Now, politically, climate and nature are still separate, with less attention on nature. Why? And do you think the adoption of the new framework incoming could help?
The climate change COP Glasgow last year clearly showed the connection between climate change and biodiversity loss. Never in the history of the conferences of the parties of the climate change has nature biodiversity being discussed at a high magnitude, as was the case in Glasgow. And this then has built momentum for the post-2020 framework. And actually, we are looking at this framework as a Paris Agreement for biodiversity and nature, and a specific target on climate change that the framework will support the implementation of the Paris Agreement is there already in the draft. So we need to see a better integration of nature and climate change in decision-making on an equal footing at national level. National plans need to build upon the premise that nature and climate change require a combined and urgent action. And ideally, they should all be across instances of government and not only separate. That is one. We also need to see governments to really take be ambitious and bold targets with clear timelines on redirecting subsidies, because the subsidies, particularly if we look at fossil fuel, when we talk of energy, we need this to be redirected into nature positive outcomes, away from nature negative.
And just finally, losing nature threatens our existence, as we've been hearing, as well as 50% of global GDP. And we've seen how the world failed the Aichi biodiversity targets. So I want to ask you, what are the crucial challenges for a successful new post-2020 global biodiversity framework and to get us to a full nature recovery by 2050?
Indeed, sadly, the previous decade we have failed to reach the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. However, of course, progress had been made in some areas, but limited progress. Lessons have been learned, and it is the result of the lessons learned because of that failure that these have actually informed the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Over 170 countries already have national biodiversity strategies and action plans in place. What we are saying, those can already be used to continue implementation and therefore contribute to the implementation of the framework. More important, which we failed in the Aichi targets, was the effective engagement of all stakeholders. Financial sector was hardly involved. Indigenous peoples, local communities, women, youth were hardly involved. There was an expectation that implementation of the Aichi targets was the responsibility of governments. We all know very clear, environmental issues cannot be dealt by one sector at national level because each one of us, including individuals, have to play a role and contribute to that. So immense consultations have been undertaken in the last 2 years plus, and thanks to the unfortunate situation of the pandemic that it has given us this extra time, and the co-chairs in particular, to conduct those consultations with the wide range of stakeholders. And that's why these stakeholders can already see themselves in the framework. So we hope all this will help us to avoid the mistakes of the last decade and move into a really ambitious, transformative pathway to 2030, when we'll check progress.
As you say, there's no time to waste.
No time to waste. Scientists have told us we either take action now or perish. And the perishing is you and me, all of us. Because if the economy fails, there are no jobs, there's no food, there's no air we breathe, clean air we breathe, the water we drink, then there's no life. And if there's no life, then we've perished. What will we leave to our children and our grandchildren? A clean planet or a degraded planet? And the responsibility is us, the parents, the leaders of today.
And Executive Secretary Espinosa, as we edge closer to the next COP27, tell me, what must global leaders learn from the UNFCCC process for climate to ensure that the world acts with the most urgency on biodiversity and, of course, on nature?
I would not presume to give lessons, but let me just share some ideas that could help build momentum to protect biodiversity and nature. First, listen to the science. Supporting the intergovernmental and national work on the most robust scientific evidence is a powerful tool to advance collective goals. Second, listen to all, and then work to build consensus. Maintaining an open, transparent, and constant engagement with all parties and non-party stakeholders, ensuring that every voice is heard and every position respected. Third, be ambitious. The threats to biodiversity and nature are the result of entrenched attitudes and practices. The world needs strong, decisive leadership that sets goals commensurate to the risks we are facing. All climate goals are about nature. The activities of the UNFCCC, CBD, and CCD have a single purpose: protecting nature. Climate action should be seen as a driving force that builds momentum for the entire environmental agenda. Emissions reductions and adaptation efforts seek ultimately to prevent runaway climate change and its potentially devastating consequences for ecosystems and the species that live in them, including us.
Now, politically, climate and nature are still separate, with less attention on nature. How can we change this? And will the adoption of a new framework in Kunming help, do you think?
The UN sister conventions devoted to the protection of the environment can work together to promote greater coherence and collaboration to achieve shared goals. The private sector must also align its operations to those principles and goals. Clear goals and measurable indicators, such as those provided by the post-2020 framework, will help us follow up on the delivery of this crucial agenda.
And what other policy tools do we need, do you think, to ensure the success of the post-2020 framework?
Strong buy-in from the private sector and civil society will also be essential. Aligning national revenue and expenditure processes to environmental goals and aligning the financial system with the environmental agenda are all critical priorities.
Now, the world is still in the process of implementing the Paris Agreement. How far do you think transparency and accountability can get us to the 1.5?
They are key to fostering trust. This trust-based exercise is the best way to make progress in a multilateral process such as this one. Under the Paris Agreement, nations are fully accountable to each other, not the UNFCCC. The same would be true of CBD and other multilateral processes.
Now, companies, investors and local government are of course key, as we've been hearing, for the ambition loop on climate and biodiversity agendas in countries. So I want to know, what is your view on the role for non-party stakeholders for the next decade in both UNFCCC and UNCBD?
The responsibility to act is clear not only for governments, but for all. The term non-party stakeholders is a fancy way of alluding to all of us in our capacity as citizens or, more widely, as members of the human race. Every person in government and in business throughout the world must make decisions that respect the planetary boundaries. Our choices as consumers and voters matter.
And what are the critical next steps, do you think, to ensure climate and nature are treated as one in national environmental plans and targets?
Governments must apply an environmental lens in which the climate, the protection of biodiversity, and the fight against desertification, as the case may be, are central in the decision-making process. It is time to break down barriers in governments. The environment is a cross-cutting issue whose goals and policies span every department and jurisdiction and also demands cross-border collaboration.
Thank you so much to you both. Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Elizabeth M. Rema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And now, what are we seeing on the ground? It's time now to take a look at how European companies are doing when it comes to climate and nature. And for this, we can check in with Rob Bailey and James Davis from the management consultancy Oliver Wyman. They're presenting this year's CDP Europe report. Good evening. Lovely to see you.
Nice to see you too. Good to see you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Before we get to reactions, first, let's take a look at the key takeaways this year.
Europe leads the way to 1.5 degrees Celsius, with 85% more companies with science-based targets now than in 2020, and driving half the rise in all global commitments. Finance is also moving. In a 50% improvement, nearly half of European financial institutions now report the financed emissions of their portfolios. But despite this progress, Europe is still far off track, as fewer than 1 in 5 companies are 1.5 degrees aligned. And wider environmental impacts may be a blind spot. Companies see average climate risks of 355 million euros, but that's 10 times larger than the impacts they see on water and 5 times larger than deforestation-linked risks. Just 5% of companies that should have strong targets to reduce their emissions, their water withdrawals, and reach zero deforestation. And companies are not on top of the impact in their full value chain. 86% of emissions are outside direct operations, but just half report this data. Leadership is limited to a few companies. If all of them matched the best performers in their industry, corporate emissions would drop by 50%.
Now, gentlemen, you say in that report that if all companies matched the best ones, European emissions could drop by 50%. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, James?
Yeah, one of the messages that came out across all of the analysis we ran this year is that progress is really being driven by a relatively small number of companies. And for that metric, we looked, the one that you quoted, we looked at the emissions intensity of the best performing companies in each sector. And the differences were really stark. We found on average the top quartile of companies were 60 to 70% better in some sectors and 50% better overall. And so really this is just giving a sense of what would be possible if best practices were spread across each industry.
And Rob, to you, one of the quite shocking findings in this year's report is that almost all companies have a blind spot and don't have targets covering emissions, forests and water. Why? What's the issue here?
So nature-related issues are rising up the agenda rapidly, but at the moment the approaches that companies are using to get to grips with nature are relatively immature and patchily applied compared to, for example, climate change, which has been progressing rapidly since 2015. And when we looked across the climate change, forest and water questionnaires that CDP asks companies to complete, we found that of the companies responding to all three of those, only 1 in 20 have a science-based target for reducing emissions and a target for preventing deforestation, a zero deforestation commitment, and a target for reducing water withdrawals.
And James, what's the risk, do you think, of companies not recognising these interlinkages?
Well, very often a lot of the most important impacts companies have and their most important dependencies lie in their supply chain. And that's actually where we found some of the biggest blind spots. And if you take water, for example, we looked at companies who have supply chains reaching into countries of relatively high water stress risk. And we found very few companies have proactive engagement policies in place in those countries and with their suppliers. And similarly on forests, whilst we did find some great examples of companies really being very proactive in how they engage with their supply chain, we found those practices really weren't very widespread. And there's a real risk that companies haven't understood or properly quantified the risks they face in this space. The methodologies and the data on nature are less mature than they are on climate, but the numbers coming out seem, strikingly lower. So if you look at water risk and forest risk, they're 5 times lower than climate risk reported by companies at the moment, and we worry that might be an underestimation.
Okay, and Rob, what do you think is needed from both policymakers and, of course, the markets to rapidly improve this?
Well, there's an awful lot actually that's going to be happening in a relatively short period of time. So, for example, this year, the international community will be agreeing a new framework for preventing biodiversity loss at Kunming. And I think really importantly, we're expecting to see the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures issue its beta framework, and the first science-based targets for nature start to be announced from companies. The only other thing I would add is that nature really is an issue that the financial services sector needs to engage with more deeply. So, for example, when we looked at financial services companies in the CDP data, we found that nearly all of them were assessing climate risks in their portfolios, but only around half of them were assessing forest-related risks, and only slightly more than half were assessing water-related risks.
That's, of course, always the challenge. James Davis, thank you so much. And Rob Bailey, thank you so much for joining us. Take care. Well, I'm joined again by Max because it's time now for our next awards, which is all about AA companies. We're going to be seeing which companies are on the A list for 2 themes this year. Max, why is that so important?
Well, Maeve, we all know that a company's environmental challenges, they don't end with emissions, and there could be no pathway towards 1.5 degrees without water and forests. So today, we're going to be recognizing the 11 European companies who have achieved the CDP AA list, because they are changing their value chains and they're driving ambitious action throughout industries, and they're fundamentally embedding nature into their strategy, while at the same time, they're helping us achieve that net zero and nature positive economy that we so urgently need.
Okay, Max, well, let's meet the companies.
For GEA, Now for Nature means it's time to act. Our ambitious climate strategy and bold science-based targets demonstrate GEA's commitment and industry leadership.
We work along the entire value chain to control and improve the sustainability of our business model. in order to deliver on our targets within climate change, forest and water security.
We recently decided to raise up our goal and ambition. Sanofi will reach carbon neutrality by 2030 in all our scope and net zero by 2050 all across operation, including value change.
We are on the right path and we are committed to do even more. The big challenge for delivering our transition plan is to catalyze action across the board.
To achieve our environmental ambitions, we need investors and capital markets to keep valuing the efforts of companies that provide disclosure and climate action.
The big challenge for achieving our environmental targets is working both on processes and on products. We address it by taking concrete actions towards a more responsible production, designing ever greener technological solutions, using more circular materials, pursuing a reduction in emissions during the use of our products.
This is vital in achieving our bold ambition to become climate positive before 2050.
The time to protect nature is now. We simply have no time to waste.
Because this is not only about protecting our planet. This is about protecting our life.
Well, now let's get the perspective from Brazil and bring in Mauro Mendes, the governor of Mato Grosso. Over 40% of the state's GDP there comes from agriculture, much of it heading here to Europe. Now, the state has pioneered tactics to combat deforestation, including working with European companies. Mr. Mendes, great to have you with us. Mato Grosso is leading on jurisdictional approaches to reduce deforestation. Why and how should companies get involved?
O Estado de Mato Grosso faz e vai continuar fazendo esse grande esforço para combater o desmatamento ilegal. A nossa meta é, até o ano de 2030, não ter nenhum tipo de desmatamento ilegal no Estado de Mato Grosso. Para isso, estamos fazendo importantes investimentos públicos e precisamos contar com a parceria das empresas privadas também. Empresas, organizações não governamentais, instituições, todos são muito bem-vindos nesse esforço para que este importante resultado da preservação dos nossos ativos florestais possa ser alcançado. E, para tanto, nós temos uma grande estratégia aqui no Estado de Mato Grosso que se chama PCI, Produzir, Conservar e Incluir, para que todas as comunidades, indígenas, quilombolas, populações ribeirinhas, agricultura familiar, eles possam ser inseridos num modelo de desenvolvimento econômico, mas preservando as nossas florestas. E as empresas privadas podem sim e devem ser grandes parceiras para este objetivo.
And how do you think will this strategy contribute to the net zero target by 2050? Can you give us some more details on how climate and forests are linked?
Nós queremos zerar as emissões de carbono até o ano de 2035. Queremos, em 2030, atingir 80% da meta para que isso possa acontecer. E as nossas florestas, a redução das emissões de carbono pelo desmatamento, elas são fundamentais para que isso possa acontecer. O Estado de Mato Grosso já está fazendo. Não vamos começar a fazer os nossos esforços para que esse objetivo possa ser atingido. Combatemos o desmatamento, estamos recuperando áreas degradadas, estamos investindo para que o perfil da nossa matriz seja alterado. Por exemplo, o Estado de Mato Grosso é líder no Brasil e uma das regiões do planeta que mais produz os biocombustíveis. Somos líderes no Brasil na produção do etanol de milho, do biodiesel, e estamos trabalhando muito numa energia limpa, que vem de pequenas centrais hidrelétricas, energias renováveis, e tudo isso melhora a performance da nossa economia permitindo que até 2035 nós tenhamos zerado as nossas emissões de carbono.
And what about the European Green Deal? Do you think that that's helping to protect Mato Grosso's nature? And where is more policy action needed, do you think, from the European Union?
Primeiro que o pacto é muito relevante, mas ele não pode olhar só para a América, não pode olhar só para o Brasil, não pode olhar só para a floresta amazônica. Esforços isolados podem não ser suficientes e não serão suficientes para contribuir para a mudança de rumo do aquecimento global em todo o planeta. O esforço coletivo que nós estamos fazendo é um esforço que precisa ser verdadeiro. Então, nós precisamos de ações mais concretas, né, que haja realmente, né, uma participação financeira nestes projetos e isso possa materializar em ações com resultados de curto prazo. Imaginar que somente em 2050 nós vamos atingir o objetivo, né, de descarbonizar a nossa economia mundial, talvez possa ser tarde, porque os sinais de que o clima está mudando, que o planeta está alterando a sua condição, eles são reais. Ninguém mais pode duvidar disso. Então, as nossas ações para mudar isto têm que ser muito verdadeiras e muito reais. Por isso que as empresas, né, e os grandes países, as grandes economias precisam de colocar mais recursos para que as ações sejam mais concretas no Mato Grosso, no Brasil, mas em todo o planeta.
And just one final question on finding the balance. How does Mato Grosso plan to remain the economic powerhouse of the Brazilian Amazon while protecting its remaining forests?
O estado de Mato Grosso, não tenham dúvida disso, é a região do planeta hoje que mais produz alimentos e, ao mesmo tempo, preserva o meio ambiente. Nos próximos anos, em uma década, no máximo em 10 anos, nós vamos nos tornar, somente o estado de Mato Grosso, o quarto produtor mundial de alimentos. Isso é muito relevante para a economia global. Mas nós vamos crescer também preservando os nossos principais ecossistemas e a nossa floresta amazônica. E esse crescimento ele vai se dar por tecnologia, com produtividade, com a transformação de áreas hoje já degradadas, já utilizadas principalmente na pecuária para a área de agricultura. E a nossa pecuária ela está migrando neste momento para os confinamentos, para as áreas menores, liberando enormes áreas para a produção das proteínas vegetais. Então, com estas estratégias de investir em tecnologia, em produtividade, em aproveitamento melhor do solo que já foi utilizado, nós iremos continuar crescendo, sendo talvez uma das mais expressivas e importantes regiões do planeta na produção de alimentos, mas seguramente nós também seremos uma grande potência na preservação e na contribuição para o clima de todo o nosso planeta.
Mauro Mendes, the governor there of Mato Grosso in Brazil, thank you so much for joining us. Obrigada.
Thank you.
Now, the green recovery. Build forward better. We're hearing so much about the need to recover the right way from COVID. But how much is just hot air? Joining me now are two of Europe's top journalists. From London, The Guardian's Fiona Harvey, and from Brussels, Kalina Rashikov from Neue Zürcher Zeitung. Great to see you there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's start by reflecting on COP26 in Glasgow. Fiona, can we still hope for more?
So the commitments that were made at COP26 were still not sufficient to halve greenhouse gases by 2030. But what countries also agreed was that we would return this year, 2022, with revised targets that should get us somewhere closer to the targets needed for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with scientific advice by 2030. So we really did achieve an awful lot at COP26, but of course we haven't got to the end of the road yet. We haven't got everything in place to fulfill what scientists say is necessary.
We haven't got to the end of the road indeed, Fiona. I mean, it seems that it's too easy to kick ambition down into the future, right, Kalina?
I mean, commitments have been made to come back this year with more ambitious climate targets. However, already days after the COP26 finished in November, and in recent months, what has become clear is that major emitters, including the EU, have no intention of fully revising or especially, more importantly, strengthening their climate targets this year. And so just to come back to the question about commitments, yes, I think the fascinating thing that we'll have to watch closely this year is to see how, especially governments in the EU, will work on implementing policies that are supposed to turn these commitments, however watered down or soft they may be perceived by the climate community, into reality.
Well, I suppose companies can be held accountable by investors and governments by their voters. Do you think that there's enough accountability, and does it work, Fiona?
Not all companies can be held accountable. It depends on the regime in which the company is operating. I mean, if you look at some of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters in the world are national oil companies. So there's an awful lot of global greenhouse gas emissions which are not accountable in the least.
Indeed, and as journalists, what convinces you from what you hear from governments or companies?
It's becoming harder and harder to bullshit. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen and that greenwashing isn't happening and that greenwashing won't be happening. And as Fiona says, that doesn't also mean that every company is transparent or every action can be held accountable. However, I do believe, and that's coming back to your question, what makes commitments or what makes statements credible for me is that the more data and the more ability you have to actually check certain commitments for yourself and compare it with others, the more likely it is to make comparisons that actually are meaningful.
And did you watch the movie Don't Look Up? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it.
I hope that it has an impact because a lot of the scenes in it were ones that will be very familiar to people who've written or read about the climate crisis because, you know, the idea of scientists just not being heard, scientists telling us that we're in extreme difficulty, that we are facing catastrophe. And now, I mean, just to talk particularly about the UK now, what we're seeing is a great upsurge of people claiming things that are completely wrong in the midst of the energy price crisis. An awful lot of the media is claiming that the energy price crisis is related to renewable energy, that renewable energy has somehow pushed up energy prices. That's just not true, but you'll see that claim made a lot. An awful lot of the media in the UK is now attacking the net zero targets and questioning whether we need those net zero targets and complaining, that they're too expensive and all kinds of things. And a lot of the coverage is completely either mistaken and wrong-headed, is putting a very generous interpretation on it, or simply cynical, which is another interpretation. And that, I think, is very dangerous.
Kalina?
What I would argue and what I've noticed and observed over the last years, what is important is not to cover climate as if it was just a single issue somewhere, I don't know, covered under the science desks or other special interest desks. What I find very encouraging is to see that most political journalists are increasingly covering climate change. And I'm happy about that. I don't think as a climate journalist, you need to write about the climate stories. That's not positive in a way. It should be general interest journalists also writing about climate change because it is a general interest story and it affects everyone. And so in that sense, I think that's crucial to have climate being part of a story across the board.
If we imagine there was no political limits and no complex negotiations, what would be the single most important policy needed, do you think, to get us to a net zero world with healthy nature? Kalina?
One policy I would argue that would be crucial is to actually learn and teach skills that is necessary to survive and prosper in a net zero world. I think that's one thing. Everyone is always talking about transitioning to net zero and shifting to greener industries and renewable energy and electric cars. And then we kind of forget that it also depends on people making that happen for real. So I think that's a policy that I would focus on in terms of education, not only to understand the facts, but also to have the skills to make it happen.
Okay, a lot needs to be done. Kalina Roshikov and Fiona Harvey, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, it's time now to check in with leading players in global finance, because we've seen momentum among banks and investors. But the question, of course, can the capital markets come good on their promises? To tell us how they're managing net zero and trying to contribute to a nature recovery, I'm joined now by the CEO of La Banque Postale, that's Philippe Heim, and Sir Ronald Cohen, the father of social investment. Lovely to see you there, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Now, as you both know, nature loss threatens 50% of global GDP. So I'd like to start with you, Philippe. How are you accounting for these risks across your portfolios?
We know that if we want to cope with the 2050 agenda, we have now to stop all new oil and gas facilities. So this is a point we take very seriously. And the new elements that we are well aware that climate risk is part of financial risk. So this is now a systemic risk. This is now taken into consideration, for example, in the supervisions made by ECB, the UK PRA. So we applied stress tests and we make sure that we're able to cope with the risk down the road. We're moving to a world where the impacts of companies are going to be as transparent as their profits. We can already see the environmental damage in monetary terms caused by thousands of companies. This enables us to judge those companies that deliver profit and impact at the same time. And financial markets, to answer your question, are the biggest lever for shifting our economies to deliver solutions to our climate and social problems rather than creating them.
Philippe Heim, you mentioned earlier your commitment, but how are you turning those commitments into action? Concretely, how has your investment strategy changed?
First of all, we were very proud that our decarbonization trajectory has been certified by an independent body, the SBTi. You know, this is a development of UN nations. Then, of course, the point for us is to take strong commitments. The one I mentioned before is that we decided to exit from oil and gas activities by 2030. And then a point that is very important is that we involved our clients in the transition. So we have decided to turn all our products for companies as well as for retail clients so that they can concretely participate to this transition.
And Sir Ronald Cohen, what are your expectations of companies like La Banque Postale?
Our expectations are that some companies will go in this direction and voluntarily reduce their emissions. But we're going to need regulation to make sure that every company achieves the objectives that we need to achieve if we're going to preserve our planet. The only way to achieve this is to have transparency on the environmental impacts that companies create. Governments don't create environmental damage, companies do. And the only way to prevent the greenwashing that we have currently, where a lot of companies are just making claims about their environmental performance, which can't be substantiated, is for regulators to step in and to mandate the publication of impact statements that show their revenues, their costs, and their environmental and social impacts.
Your reaction to that, Philippe Heim?
Yes, I fully agree to what has been said by Ronald, in the sense that there is a thin boundary between communication and real commitments. And we have to be aware of that because it is fueling growing distrust, for example, among young people. There is this, eco-anxiety, and we need to address that. That's why I do agree that we need rules. We need regulators to step in and to impose a common set of language. So in that sense, the taxonomy, the European taxonomy, I think is a very good step forward.
And to Ronald Cohen, do you think that investors will have to lower their expectations for return on equity?
No, I believe that optimizing risk-return impact, as I say in my book, Impact, will deliver better returns for investors than optimizing risk and return alone, because you avoid the risk of regulation and of taxation, and you take advantage of changes in values that mean that consumers want to buy your product, talent wants to work for you, and investors want to invest in you.
But I guess the big problem is, gentlemen, is that markets are so driven by short-termism. So I guess my question to you both is, how can climate and nature risks to be accounted for if there's so little alignment between fund managers' time horizons and the impact on the environment? Philippe Heim, I'll ask you that one.
Yes, that's sure. We need to expand time horizons. So that's for sure. But at the same time, I'm pretty optimistic. So there is a growing awareness among investors that can distinguish companies that have to finance deep and severe transition, and those who are already, let's say, up and running. And so we can see, for example, in asset management, in private banking, that you have two kinds of clients. So as those who have a strong awareness, are militants for a cause, and that's very interesting, that from a pure financial standpoint, they consider that investing in green is a wise investment, a wise choice to optimize their profit. So I think so there is a movement that is already in place. That's why I think it's pretty positive. So we need now to align all actors, all stakeholders, to continue with that direction.
And Sir Ronald Cohen, what do you think is the ultimate impact that investment can have now, where money is most needed and where it's most impactful?
There's no doubt that we're going to find innovation leads us to new forms of clean energy. Hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars are going to go in that direction. But at the same time, there are big social issues around us. Diversity is a major issue that we've not been able to solve. And so I see a lot of money also going to companies that have the right product and the right employment practices, that don't use child labor, that don't underpay their workers below the living wage. So we've shifted the goalposts for business now from achieving profit alone to achieving profit and impact. And the two are linked. We can already see that the companies that pollute more are worth less on the stock exchange.
And Philippe, of course, stock prices could fall 41% with a carbon price of $150. So my question to you is, how would investors deal with this?
Well, that's why investors now are applying, let's say, pretty in-depth due diligence in their investments. So, for example, in asset management, our teams now are conducting pretty in-depth analysis before any investment.
And Sir Cohen, do you think that our current macroeconomic indicators are fit for how investors can meet their ambitions to decarbonise and decouple their portfolios from negative nature impacts?
We don't have a system in place to deliver the impacts we need. That's why we spent 4 decades until now trying to create consensus about climate. In the 30s, we didn't have transparency on profit. And the US government came in and established generally accepted accounting principles and the use of auditors. We need the same thing today in order to measure the impacts of companies in a granular way.
But Sir Ronald Cohen, why do you think we still don't have a global price on carbon?
We don't have a global price on carbon because you can't expect companies to agree to something that's going to make them look bad. You need an outside body to establish a standard. This is going to be the price of carbon, and here's the scientific evidence for it. And that's how companies are going to prepare their impact figures. Until you have that, people are going to be using $10 or $100. And we need standardization. That's why we don't have it. And regulators will have to put it in place so that we can compare the carbon footprints of different companies.
And Philippe, what is your definition of a really true green company?
This is a company, I would say, if we simplify, so in a nutshell, this is a company that has completely changed its own governance. So that is led by a clear purpose and has changed also its governance. So as far as we are concerned, we have established a purpose which clearly has a goal, the just transition.
And same question to you, Sir Ronald Cohen. Just a brief answer, if you will.
I agree with Philippe about governance. At the end of the day, a company that measures its impact and shows that it is delivering improving impacts year after year, just as it does with profits, and does so in the environmental area, is a green company.
Sir Ronald Cohen, thank you so much for joining us. And Philippe, I'm the CEO there of La Banque Postale. Thank you so much. Really interesting stuff there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So a big role for the financial sector, as we just heard. But the big question, are markets up for the job? Joining me to discuss this now from Paris is Laurent Babiquion, Joint Global Director, Capital Markets at CDP. Laurent, great to see you there. Thanks for joining us.
Great to see you. Hello, Maeve.
Now, I'd like to start by asking you if you think our current financial system is up for the job.
No, frankly, I don't think it is. Our economic theory has always considered that nature is free and its resources unlimited. And we now know that those two assumptions are just wrong. De facto, the economic indicator that we're currently using are not reflecting anymore our reality and are not helping us to predict the future. So we really need to reinvent our economic theory by taking into account, for example, the cost of nature. One of the things we should be starting at doing is to put a price on all negative externalities. I'm thinking of a carbon tax, I'm thinking of a pollution tax, biodiversity tax, so that the market would have the right signals and the right price information to value assets.
Okay, so the financial sector clearly not ready. So the question is, the financial institutions, what do they need to be doing today, Laurent?
I mean, they need to be doing three things. First thing, they need to calculate 100% of their financed emissions. And then they need to disclose it. And once they have the scope 3, they need to set a science-based target aligned to 1.5 degree by 2050 and by 2030.
But what are you hearing? What do investors need? And what does the system need to move the needle dramatically?
They need to be able to do a better job, and they need to have more companies aligned with 1.5 degrees by 2050. That's clearly not enough, and they need to have a much higher number. This is why it is so important that investors join the CDP SBT campaign that is gathering investors to request 1,600 heavy emitting companies to join the Science-Based Target Initiative by setting 1.5 degree target. And then there is another thing that we need. We need the investors to start thinking differently about how they value their performance. Most probably, the adjustment variable of the net zero, nature positive economy will be a lower return on equity on the market. And at the same time, if investors are doing a good job in integrating ESG without greenwashing, they will have an increase of their impact, and they will need to measure this impact in what we call the return on impact.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, Laurent. And just these Climatric Funds Awards that we're celebrating today, can you just remind us, what are they for? And are the investors with winning funds already on the right track?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Climatrix is the only environmental rating which is 100% transparent in the world. You have a free-to-access webpage to see the rating of 18,000 funds from all around the world. And today we're celebrating the top 20 funds across 4 categories. And they achieve an outstanding performance, and I would like to congratulate them. And clearly, those funds are very well advanced on the pathway to net zero nature positive economy.
Okay, Laurent, really interesting insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maeve. See you soon. Bye.
Well, now, let's see the winning funds.
We must act now for nature, and asset managers must be more ambitious and accountable.
Targeting carbon neutral and nature positive through engagement, collaboration, and the creation of a dedicated biodiversity restoration fund, our goal is to deliver nature positive portfolios.
Last year we implemented a decarbonisation of the value metric in our strategy, reducing the environmental footprint without lowering the return premium.
Robeco has committed itself to a net zero ambition by 2050. Our fund aims to have a significant lower environmental footprint, including, of course, greenhouse gas emissions.
Our strategy ensures our fund has a low impact on climate, forests and water by integrating ESG deeply into the investment process and by putting focus on stewardship activities as well.
Our strategy ensures that the fund has a low impact on climate by limiting the carbon footprint, the water consumption and the waste generation.
The one word that describes winning a Climatrix Fund Award this year is responsibility. Indeed, it means we are recognized as an exemplary fund and asset manager in terms of environmental performance. It is our duty to live up to this example we set in each investment decision we make.
We are thrilled to win this award, but the strong field also indicates that the industry is shifting and there's an increasing amount of capital being directed in a positive way.
Oh no, but also recognition of our climate strategy.
We're very proud of our commitment to driving positive change and to demonstrating this to our clients.
Teamwork, because our climate strategy is not only implemented in our investment process, but in our entire organization.
To achieve our commitment to have a completely net zero portfolio, we need companies to cut their direct emissions, as well as having a positive impact on the emissions that occur across the entire value chain.
We need companies with the strongest level of commitment regarding climate and biodiversity issues.
We need companies to set scientific-based climate goals, as well as ensure that the entire supply chain is Paris-aligned. Companies must have a clear strategy and time frame for the business transition to achieve those goals.
We need to invest in companies providing solutions towards limiting global warming.
Having a climate-conscious investment approach is not only vital for delivering sustainability outcomes, but also for delivering sustainable investment returns over the long term.
Now with nature means bold action. We must urgently allocate capital to solutions for a sustainable future and to businesses willing to make the transition.
Well, now it's time for our final awards, and for that we can bring in Max again. This time we're focusing on companies scoring A for their performance on climate change, on forests and on water security. Max, these CDP AAA companies, any new faces this year?
Well, Maeve, there is no net zero without nature, just as there is no 1.5 degree without forests, and of course, we don't have a planet without water. And that's why I'm so proud that Europe is home to 6 out of the 14 AAA list companies around the world. We have Danone, Firmenich, L'Oreal, and Symrise once again showcasing their environmental leadership. And they're joined for the first time by Lenzing and Metsabord Corporation. These companies, they are in the vanguard. And they're leading us to a truly 1.5 degree world and showing us that it is now for nature.
Okay, Max, well, let's meet them. Let's meet those leaders.
For Symrise, now for nature means taking the lead on environmental transparency and action.
It's the recognition that we don't have healthy food unless we have healthy nature.
Means ensuring our activities are respectful of the planetary boundaries.
the year of COP26 and the IPCC 6th assessment report, the scale of the risk to business from climate change, water insecurity and deforestation can no longer be ignored.
Our efforts to deploy nature-based solutions are delivering results. Indeed, in 2020, Danone reduced its GHG footprint by 1 million tonnes, and half of this was thanks to changing farming practices to regenerative agriculture.
Major investments with a total value of over 500 million euros are ongoing at our mills in Finland and Sweden. The investments will enable sustainable growth for Metsä Board and our customers.
Germany is acting on climate change every single day with 100% renewable electricity, carbon neutral operations by 2025, and long-term science-based targets.
To push our environmental solutions further, we need clear OK signals from policymakers and early regulatory guidance.
We are addressing it with science-based target for Scope 3 emissions, by asking our suppliers to respond to CDP, and by collaborating with customers to build momentum with their suppliers.
Building strong alliances and co-developing innovative tech solutions will allow us to achieve our ambitious targets for 2030.
Now is the time for one agenda, one integrated climate and nature agenda for all stakeholders. Now is the time to drive action together on the ground.
The AAA companies there showing us what real environmental leadership can look like. But the question is, what will leadership look like in the future? To see where the markets are heading, let's bring in now Paul Simpson, the CEO of CDP Worldwide. Paul, good to see you there.
Very nice to see you too.
First question to you, how are you enjoying the CDP Europe Awards 2022 so far? Any takeaways?
One of the things that really comes through is the need to have a holistic approach to tackling climate change and nature, that we can't do one without the other. And certainly at CDP, part of our new strategy is very much to bring those two elements together.
And is that why you have launched a new strategy now?
We heard from Johan Rockström earlier of the need to consider all planetary boundaries. So part of CDP's new strategy recently launched, and the work we plan to do between now and 2025 is to embrace all of those planetary boundaries. So to add biodiversity, oceans, waste, plastics to the disclosure process so that the markets are getting a holistic perspective of companies' environmental performance.
And tell us, what will all that mean then for those disclosing to CDP?
Well, for companies who are disclosing to CDP, all have started really with climate and, as I added, water and forest. And over the next few years, the expectations will be that companies disclose their impacts on all of those planetary boundaries. But we will make some changes by bringing in an integrated questionnaire to make the disclosure process more efficient. And we're also looking to score and assess different metrics. So we'll be looking at how are companies performing against the transition of what the science requires.
And Paul, will CDP's new strategy make things a little bit easier for companies?
We certainly seem to make that a very efficient process, helping companies meet the needs of all of their investors and their customers. We will be looking to integrate other leading global standards into our platform to drive that efficiency, the EU taxonomy, the EU sustainability reporting requirements, and the International Sustainability Standards Board's new climate and other standards. And as we look for what the science really requires, we know that we need to address dynamic and double materiality. And it's that double materiality, the impact on the firm and the planet, that is absolutely key. So we will seek to drive that. The EU's work on sustainability reporting is really pushing that agenda in a wonderful way, and we will look to implement that into the work CDP does.
Paul Simpson, the CEO there of CDP Worldwide, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Now, my last guest today is none other than the Prime Minister of Lithuania, Ingrida Šimonytė. We sat down to talk nature-first policies, green growth, and what the country expects from its companies, cities, and the financial sector. Thank you so much, Prime Minister Simonica, for speaking to us here and for joining us on Euronews for Now for Nature. So my question is, are you confident that the European Union will be able to achieve this net nature positivity by 2030?
I'm quite positive, although, of course, there are wins that we need to be aware of, because we should be very careful and not let the daily problems undermine or hamper the ideas of green transition. Because, well, you can see this happening even now as we see the soaring prices of energy in most of the countries. And this should be a signal that we actually need to change, because our reliance on fossil fuels that sometimes are, not traded on the real markets is such a big vulnerability for all of us that we actually also must understand this green transition as a part of our national security agenda. So yes, there are circumstances that might be hampering on our ambition, but I think that the debate that we now are having on Fit for 55 package brings me at least reasonable confidence in that European Union will do what is European Union's part. But of course, it's not just European Union that need to be part of this. It is the global challenge, as we said, and for this global challenge, we need all other parties to be on board as well.
OK, well, talk us through what the Lithuanian government is doing exactly to scale up innovation and green solutions to drive exactly what you described, a net zero, nature-positive economy.
Well, last year we have adopted a climate change agenda for the country that is aligned to the global goals and EU targets. And this is an agenda that is up to 2050, which is the date to achieve the climate neutrality. But also we have local agendas that are important in different aspects of this big picture, and that starts from, for example, renovation of buildings or mobility plans, up to 100% of green procurement that we want to achieve by 2023, which is next year, because we think that all those parts of the different policies should adhere to the major goals, and this is the climate neutrality by 2050. And of course, what is important in this respect is that being an ambitious country with a very high ambition in a broad sense for higher value added and innovations, we want to focus in the areas where innovation is even more important than in general, and that comprises the life sciences, but also the eco innovations that are so important in achieving the 2050 goals for the whole planet.
And on biodiversity, of course, all eyes now are on the next COP15 taking place in Cumming. What do you think the outcome should be, and how does Lithuania's policy on biodiversity and nature link into this global agenda?
Well, I think this is, as I mentioned, this is a part of the big picture. So we are not only looking at ourselves, what we can do as a country, as a segment, as a part of the planet, but we also need to be a part of this big movement, this global movement, and have a say in this. So basically, I think that it is very important to stick to agreements. It's very important to understand that this is a global challenge and nobody can sort that out alone. So my expectations would be that we should set us the targets that are ambitious and realistic, and then we should all put our heart into achieving the goals.
Turn the words into deeds. It's always the tricky challenge, right? And on that note, when it comes to pushing, what do you precisely expect from Lithuanian companies, from the financial sector and from local government on climate and nature in terms of action and also in terms, of course, of transparency?
Well, I think it's not the government alone that can actually achieve the change, especially when we speak of the change of such a big magnitude. So definitely every part of society has its part to take in this process. Companies, they have to invest. They have to change their production habits, their supply chains, their production outcome towards more environment-friendly solutions. And here, government can give a hand, especially for SMEs, to make this adjustment easier, but also big companies in many cases need quite substantial investments. And here we see the play of the financial sector that has to participate in the role of facilitator in financial market to encourage these investments and to support, to provide financial means for companies on competitive market to invest in this area. And I think financial markets, financial institutions also understand that this green agenda is here to stay, and therefore there is a business case in this. And of course there is a part that needs to be played by non-governmental organizations or local communities, as well as broader society, people. On one hand, raising awareness and sometimes maybe initiating incentives or actions that are behind the market solution, so to say. And also people need to be aware of the fact that this is the only planet we have, so we need to each of us need to put his or her own effort into this, and then we can achieve the results. So there is a role for everybody in this.
A very strong call to action there from the Lithuanian Prime Minister Ingrida Šimonytė. And that brings the CDP Europe Awards 2022 pretty much to an end, Max. Any final thoughts?
Yes, Maeve. Some really insightful dialogue, and I'd really like to thank a few key CDP supporters who really have helped evolve our missions. Supporters that help drive a 1.5 degree economy, living in harmony with nature. Particularly, I'd like to thank the European Commission's LIFE program. LIFE has helped CDP mainstream disclosure and drive science-based environmental ambition that's in line with the European Green Deal. Thanks also to the many other donors and partners that make CDP's work possible. And for today's event, I'd like to thank our Euronews partners for their collaboration. I'd also kindly like to thank all of our sponsors, and particularly to Beiersdorf, L'Oreal, and Symrise, and of course to Oliver Wyman for once again presenting our CDP Europe report. Finally, I'd like to recognize the CDP Europe staff for working so closely throughout the year with European companies, investors, cities, regions, and policymakers, all to help bring about urgent change in the European markets and society and globally to create an economy that works for people and planet. Urgent change. Are we getting there? Well, today, we've heard that our systems need real and urgent systemic change, and our A-listers are showing what's possible. But it's really now for nature. Nature must define corporate strategy. It must define our investments and policy, and of course, our actions as citizens. And if we are successful, if we limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and if we live within our planet limits and let nature fully recover, if we do this, we know that we'll live in a fair world, and this would be a world with less poverty, with less violence, with fewer environmental disasters. And this is the world that we all want, and this is the world that we need, because it's really now code red. The margins, they are so thin. It's now for nature or nothing. Thanks for watching.